Hello everyone, and welcome to another album podcast. This time about the album Fall of the Northern Kingdom. I know it's been a little while since I did the previous album podcast. That was for Winter Solstice. So this one, we're going to jump straight in. We're going to talk about Fall of the Northern Kingdom, the kind of writing process of that album for me. We're going to talk about each of the individual tracks, maybe a bit about the lyrics, the themes, and kind of a bit about the production, because it differs a bit from the previous album, Winter Solstice. So I thought we need to kind of go through that a little bit. So let's kick off then. The writing process. So to write this album, it was a little bit different to Winter Solstice. I think the theme is really where I want to touch on first. So the theme for Fall of the Northern Kingdom, I wanted something that was more rooted in Arthurian legend, in British and Celtic mythology. I really sort of wanted to explore Welsh, Scottish history, parts of England as well. Really dive in to that British and Celtic mythology and folklore, but also sort of weave it in together with more of a historic narrative than Winter Solstice used, and kind of steer a little further away from what was originally set down for the band, away from some of the sort of satanic themes. I thought I was kind of writing myself maybe a bit into a corner with those, and as well, I've always been really interested in folklore, in history, in mythology, legends. These things they're just really fascinating to me, and so I really wanted to explore that further. So now kind of on to how did I write the music for the album. So I think it would be unfair to not give the credit where it's due. I think the main riff for Fall of the Northern Kingdom, that song in particular, that was kind of a creation of Ulthagor, the previous guitarist of the band. He sort of laid the foundation for that track, if you will. And so from there, I was kind of able to build it up then into becoming something a bit more. And the name as well, it's actually a name that he sort of really liked. It was a name I picked out of, surprisingly, the Bible. So Ulthagor sort of heard the name I said about, Fall of the Northern Kingdom. That sounds like a really cool name for a song. And he thought, yeah. And he wrote a riff specifically to fit that sort of theme. And I think that theme kind of encompasses the album really well. It's quite melodic, it's catchy, it's got a sort of Rotting Christ-esque feel to it, which is something that I really enjoy. Rotting Christ is a band that I absolutely love, and they're definitely instrumental in the sound and the feel, and the whole inspiration behind Black Pyre and the riffs, and it's something that's really underpinned this album and the previous Winter Solstice as well. These sort of Rotting Christ inspired riffs, but then I like to merge it in with a few other inspirations. So in this album I've really sort of delved more into the melodic side of black metal. Of course, bands like Dissection and Watain, these are some of the highest in the genre. These are the kings of this particular field. But I think my inspiration really came from more of the UK bands who have been inspired by these other big bands. So in this album, I was really inspired by Ninkasag. Ninkasag really gave me the ideas for Pale Orchid, actually. These riffs sort of began constructing in my head, as a result of listening to Ninkasag. I really enjoyed as well the way the melodies play out, in the structure, and it's kind of got a little bit of a Dissection feel to Ninkasag, so I really tried to channel that into Pale Orchid. But the first riff that I came up with for Pale Orchid was actually the acoustic intro part. Now that piece was somewhat inspired by Opeth. They have these iconic acoustic guitar sections, and that was kind of something that I wanted as well for Black Pyre. But there was something a bit missing from just an acoustic section, so I sort of had to play around with layers. I was playing with strings, there's some horns in there, that sort of thing, to give it that wider feel, to sort of bring a bit more Emperor to it, give it a bit more orchestral, bit more sort of oomph to that riff. So that's kind of the writing process then for Pale Orchid. The rest of the album then kind of flows a lot from that sort of melodic side of black metal. I wanted something a bit more riffy than the previous album. I wanted things that have a bit more evolved melody, things that can kind of have a catchy hook to them, something that you can listen to once and go away and be humming all day. That's really what I wanted to capture here. And I think, you know, to some extent that's been pretty successful. You know, Pale Orchid has a pretty catchy riff. I'm very proud of that one. I'm also really proud of Withering Winter. Now this track may be a little on the underrated side. Yeah, it's got a good amount of plays, but it's definitely one of my favourites. And mostly for the solo. It's got a lot of melodic feel to it. There's some really kind of fast parts to it. Kind of slow it down as well. I think it really channeled the sort of Watain sound of a solo, combining maybe an element of the classic rock and classic metal stuff, but then sort of rolling it into the extreme metal feel. Then we've got songs like Far Away Into the Sky. Now Far Away Into the Sky is a bit of a departure from the usual Black Pyre sound. For that song I wanted to capture something a lot more atmospheric. I wanted to capture something that wasn't as mid or faster tempo, but much of a slower tempo. I really wanted to delve into the sort of sadder side of black metal with that song. I think in part it's been inspired by my journey with my new band Ovnus, in which I'm the vocalist. I think Far Away Into the Sky, really one of those tracks that, although it's got a sort of repetitive riff, it feels like it builds atmosphere. It channels those early atmospheric bands, but then has a little bit of some of the more modern atmospheric, and maybe even a touch of post-black metal. I think it really nicely encompasses what I was trying to convey, which is a kind of depression around death, and especially grief, but more of a grief for one's own death, perhaps mourning oneself before we've even gotten to death itself. Then I should really touch on the track Moonlit Ether. Now this track is a cover, but it's a cover of my own material, so I'm not sure if anybody will recall, but I released a solo album a little while back called Primordial Forest. Now in that solo album, my favourite track was Moonlit Ether. Now Moonlit Ether, back in that time, the production was fine, but I think it could have been better. So I decided to redo the track as Moonlit Ether, but for Black Pyre. And it sort of works now because Black Pyre, now being a solo project of myself and without the other members, it lends itself well to looking and revisiting some of these old tracks that I did as a solo artist. I think in part because what I was doing as a solo artist before is now quite well reflected in Black Pyre, and I think the direction I've been taking Black Pyre as a solo artist is much more in line with what I was releasing beforehand. And then we've got tracks like The Pale. Now The Pale is a much longer track than I'm perhaps used to putting out in the main. I think the reason for that was that I just kept hearing evolutions of the riff, of the melody, of the structure of the song, and I just had to keep putting in the next piece. You know, I'd have a riff and I'd have a drum beat, and then I'd think, oh, there's a way I can evolve that again, and then there was another way to evolve it again, and there was another way again. So it just sort of kept spiraling and spiraling, and it kind of ended up as a sort of proggy epic in a way. You know, in proggy in the sense that it doesn't follow a conventional structure. There's no real verse, chorus, anything like that. It sort of meanders and follows a path and traces out, and then eventually sort of comes to a quiet close with a very atmospheric build. Now for the end of the track, I wanted to really give the folky atmosphere. So I put in the harp sounds that you can hear in there and gave it a kind of jaunty jig sort of feel. Maybe something you'd hear in a medieval tavern, that kind of thing. Another thing I did with the Pale that I haven't done before with Black Pyre, but is something that came off the back of working in Ovnus, is that I put in a low voice, a low sort of clean choir, maybe something akin to a Welsh choir or a monastery choir of monks specifically. And I thought that really added an additional layer, a new way of adding melody in, and I think it's something that I'm definitely going to continue exploring with Black Pyre, although somewhat sparingly. I think it needs to have the right place in the music. I can't just use it in every single song, but where I can, I think it's worthwhile me fitting those sorts of things in, because it's nice to have some of the clean vocals in, but of course they have to be in keeping with the music, in keeping with the black metal sound, with the black metal sort of ethos that is Black Pyre. And that's why the sort of monastery choir, the low vocal that I did, sort of fits, because it just fits the sound. So now onto some of the additional lyrical themes. So one of the themes that I mentioned about earlier was the Arthurian legend. Now the song Castell Caeredin goes on a bit of a tangent about Edinburgh Castle, but specifically the history sort of that goes with Edinburgh Castle, not just the castle itself. I really wanted to focus on a specific story that I read in the Book of Aneurin, which talks about the men of Dinedin, and they're on their way to the Battle of Catraeth. And in this battle, you know, people get caught up, people die, and the only person that lives to tell the tale is Cynon ap Clydno. Now Cynon tells his story, and that's really what I wanted to go through with Castell Caeredin, but also weave in perhaps a little of the struggle of the men of Dinedin that had to leave their homes to fight a war in a land that they've never been to, that they will never see again. But then back onto the subject of Cynon, it also explores his whole adventure. In Arthurian legend, Cynon ap Clydno goes on these adventures to the Castle of Maidens. There's a whole series of trials he has to go through. He has to fight the Black Knight. There's this whole ordeal with Giant. And I think that this sort of thing is not explored well enough within black metal. And I really noticed an opening for a Celtic and British perspective on these ideas, on these Arthurian legends, and take it back to some of the original source text, like the Book of Aneurin, like the Mabinogion. Then Fall of the Northern Kingdom, the track specifically, follows on directly in the aftermath of the Battle of Catraeth and the men of Dinedin that stayed at Castell Caeredin. It goes into the deaths of these people and the ultimate demise of the Northern Kingdom, or Hen Ogledd as it was known back then. And this is where the real blending of history and folklore comes in, the sort of blurring of the lines between what is written down as legend, what was told in those stories, but combining that with historic accounts of these battles, I think is really a place that hasn't been yet fully explored, and it's something that I really want to continue delving into with Black Pyre and with the next album as well. So finally then, the notes on production. So as you'll have noticed, the production for this album is a stark difference to Winter Solstice. Now personally, I prefer the production for Fall of the Northern Kingdom. I think it's come on a long way since Winter Solstice. It has a different feel, granted, and I think that is in part due to the difference in musicians, in that, you know, Fall of the Northern Kingdom is only me, whereas Winter Solstice was a full band effort. You know, every single member contributed their own instruments and recorded those instruments, whereas with this album I've recorded everything myself, so naturally there will be differences between the way things are played. That aside though, the production itself is mostly different due to the amplifiers used. Now for Winter Solstice, my preference, I used a Mesa Boogie copy specifically the Joyo Bantamp. Now, this Joyo Bantamp was the Zombie Edition. However, for Fall of the Northern Kingdom, I opted for a different setup, so I got my hands on a Soldano 100. Now, the Soldano was the primary sound then used for this album, combined with the standard SM57 on the V30 cab. You can't beat that sound for a cabinet. But then what also sets this album apart is the difference in the drums as well. The drum kit, I believe we used the Yamaha 9000 Recording Custom, and then Zildjian cymbals for the album, which is a little different to Winter Solstice, which used the Meinl Custom Dark range. They were the cymbals of Dominus. Now those cymbals are excellent, they really are wonderful cymbals, and I think perhaps it's something of a shame that I wasn't able to use those same cymbals on this album. I think that was something that I would like to potentially explore in future, is getting some of those Meinl Custom Darks. The bass tone for the album for Fall of the Northern Kingdom is quite similar to the bass tone that Shodflatter used to use on Winter Solstice. I opted to go for a broadly similar tone, really scoop out some of those mids, especially at 500 Hz, give a really good compression to the low end of the bass, and a really distorted high while injecting in some of those higher mid frequencies, 1500 Hz, that sort of thing. And it really gives the bass a sort of clanky feel, a lot like what Shodflatter was doing. I really loved his bass tone, so it's something that I tried to emulate for myself when recording this album. One of the main differences, of course, is going to be the instrument itself. Rather than his specific bass, I used a Washburn bass. It's an old Washburn active bass, and I think it gave quite a nice colour to the sound and gave me some of the clarity I was looking for in the bass playing, so you can kind of pick out some of those bass parts if you listen carefully. So I think that just about does it for all of the parts of Fall of the Northern Kingdom. Thank you so much for listening, and if you've bought the album, thank you very much for your support. If you're streaming the album, your support is also much appreciated, and if you're pirating the album, well, just make sure to tell your friends about it and maybe buy a CD as well. I won't say anything. Alright, cheers, thank you very much.